Okay, you're back for more, maybe. All right, so I checked and I don't have any more questions, but again, the ones that I do have kind of cover a good swath of Standard 8. So I'm going to go ahead and answer and then figure out what to do when the rest of you guys submit your questions. And just as a helpful hint, the submission is actually worth some easy points, so you might want to go ahead and do that, even though I've made the recording. All right, so in general, Standard 8 is the one about research and publication, which I didn't expect as many questions because this is the one that you guys, I think, get more than anything else in your other classes. But I have again, you kind of clustered. Like there's several questions about informed consent, publication and publication credit, and I think at least one about humane treatment of animals. And so one of the things I'll say, in case I forget when we get later, keep in mind that this is where you also have federal guidelines about how to conduct research. There are federal guidelines about the care of animals. And so I would say that you should not assume the APA is the final end-all be-all of what you have to do. I'm going to argue that my take is always that our code tends to sometimes be more stringent than federal law and other guidelines. But if you're going to do research, you've got to know all of those as well. Most of the relevant research-related sort of law is actually on or has a link to it on the IRB website on our IRB website. Okay, got a text message. All right, so I tried to put these in order again and to try to kind of do it with the code also so I could be a little ghostly pale figure in the bottom corner and not, just me on the screen. Although I will say I get I have this whole thing where it switches like pictures every day. That was kind of cool. A little bright, but kind of cool. All right, back to ethics. Oh no, wait, wrong thing. All right, so you guys got the whole part about needing institutional approval. One of the things, though, I will say, when I taught Intro to Clinical, I was always surprised by the number of people like in private practice who are still sort of trying to do research, which would mean, though, there's not like an institutional approval process. What I would suggest is if it's something that you want to do, most folks who are trying to do some sort of research as like a private practitioner, usually what ends up happening is they at some point will also need access to more participants, which would require, for example, either a hospital affiliation or a university affiliation. I've helped some of those folks out there collect data before, which means it would have to go through our IRB. I think you just kind of have to be really careful. So the first question I'm actually going to answer is a broad one, or some broad kind of, about this and sort of in general, not about a specific code. And so, for example, I have a question about how can a psychologist ensure the integrity of their research while still facing pressures of the outside world in terms of publishing? That's a really good question. And we started off this semester with you guys finding some examples of where people didn't do that, or didn't take the proper thought and care for the people that they were basically working with. I think that you have to, I'm going to say the same thing I've said the whole time. You need to know that you're biased. You need to know that there is a probability that you will slip up. And you need to operate as if your job is to keep you from doing those things. And you never need to forget the irreparable harm that you will do if you turn into a Wakefield Jr. At some point, there are these questions where it's not real clear. And I think, granted, this doesn't seem like it's at the same level of what do I do in a crisis if there's not an identified patient or an identified victim. But it's the same thing. You have to be able to sleep at night. And while it might not seem like that big of a deal if you just fudge a few numbers, think about what Wakefield's done. And the fact that measles are sort of, they're starting to be concerned that measles is going to become entrenched again, that there just aren't enough people getting vaccinated to actually keep it at bay. And a disease that was eradicated during my lifetime is going to come back. It does harm. So don't ever forget that. It might not seem like it's a big deal that somebody was sort of over-interpreting their power poses, but it has the potential to do harm. And if it's not a direct harm like Wakefield, it has the potential to further cast doubt upon the research that's out there, which is also part of what's gotten us into a whole lot of trouble here lately. And so with therapy, you never want to forget the awesome responsibility, and you have to be aware of the damage you can do. And you take every step you can to not do that. With research, you should not think of it as not doing damage, because it can. Now, a lot of times, and maybe it is that big of a deal, but you can. And so you keep that in mind. And if you feel like you're in a position where you're pressured to start bending that, I don't like the slippery slope argument about some things. Like, I don't think if you have a beer that you're going to become a raging alcoholic. I think people sometimes can stop at, pot and not move on to heroin, hopefully. But you break the rules once. It's called the foot in the door, right? Like, you get your foot in the door, you get them to say yes once, then it's just easier to do it again. So remember that this could go very badly for you and for the people and for the people you're working with and for the discipline that you're a part of. So that, unfortunately, is my only advice for that. There's not like a, hey, do this. Also, though, you can also make sure that when you're doing these things, you have as many people looking over your shoulder as you can. You have collaborators. You make sure you send it through the IRB. You don't go rogue. You don't only work with students. You have other people who are reviewing and seeing your work and what you're doing. So that's that sort of broad one. How does one ensure that within a university setting that a professor that is conducting research includes an informed consent when most of the time the survey is given to Psych 101 majors that they don't know much about research and therefore cannot report to an authority figure that an informed consent was not included? Okay, so we got again the APA ethical code versus federal guidelines. Technically, university guidelines is that we don't have to have an informed consent. We just have to have a cover letter when it's anonymous research. And there are exceptions for anonymous research, which is a lot of what I do. And so it has to be anonymous. Basically, though, like I told you guys, one of the reasons why I have students like actually enter their initials and click yes, is that for me, it's not a really long, I won't say drawn out, but detailed informed consent. But they are acknowledging that they are going to do this, or they want to do this. We also make it kind of a multi-step process where they have to sign up on Sona and then click the link. So basically, it's important for us to do that. Now, there are ways for the students to actually report it. Unfortunately, they are a vulnerable population and that they don't know a lot except that. Keep in mind that in Psych 101, that second chapter that they do, or part of the first chapter, is on research. And one of the things that the instructors are supposed to be explaining to them is informed consent. And that usually happens before those surveys are ever going up. In addition, you should have a debriefing. And that debriefing, it has contact information for who to contact if there's a problem. Also, if you don't want to contact the researcher, to contact the IRB with information about that. We are obligated to offer those things and make sure that the students have those things. After that, we rely on, unfortunately, the honor code, and again, having more people with eyes on. So, for example, for you guys, technically the Sona administrator is supposed to sort of look over everything. Dr. Holtzman, who's doing that, felt like, and he's right, it should be the faculty supervisor's responsibility to check the students' work. You guys are involved in research. And so what happens is, like, I usually, most surveys are basically sort of shared with me as the survey monkey master, which sounds really strange. Anyway, so the idea is that we need to spot check, and we have to rely on people to tell us. So the students might not know that they're supposed to tell us, but if you're somebody's RA and you think there's an issue, then you have the ability to talk to the faculty member, me, somebody else if it's me doing something. This is when it is important that we hold each other accountable. So, not a great answer, but that's the best one I got. But basically, we have to do informed consent. And I told you guys, one of the things that becomes kind of debatable, and I think it's if you work with kids or not, is there are some who argue that passive consent is okay. And I think I'm just going to say you're going to get a lot of opinions about that, and y'all are going to have to basically form your own opinion about it as you move through your career. So we have to make sure, though, that we don't entice people, or we don't not explain to them what's going to happen. So we can phrase things, right? Like, I don't want to tell students that I'm doing a survey about stigma, because then I'm going to set it up for them to respond a certain way. I can say I'm going to ask them their opinions about a variety of conditions. This is what they're doing. It's just not using that jargon. If you're doing pain research, if you tell people you're going to feel pain, okay, that might be cause some difficulties with your recruitment. If it is pressure that could be uncomfortable, that might be a better descriptor of what you're actually doing, then you can do that. But you got to explain it to them. And you have to have an explicit statement regarding the right to decline or withdraw participation without being penalized. Now, I know later there's a question about, there's another code that says they have to know what those penalties might be, and I'll explain that in a second when we get to it. But, the nature of this research we do, we can't penalize them in terms of if they want to withdraw from the study. Now, the flip side is that there was an issue with us not getting people, they would not show up to in-person research studies. So there is actually a penalty with the enrichment credits. However, the way those are set up is that if the student doesn't show up, there's a penalty, but then they have the ability to earn the credits back. And it can't dip into the rest of their test grade, if that makes sense. So that would technically be a penalty, but they still have the right to withdraw and it not, I know I'm dancing. This is where I start going, well, maybe we shouldn't do that at all. The idea, though, is that you can't force somebody to do the research. And if there is a consequence, it cannot be significant enough that it might unduly entice someone to do something that they don't really want to do. And so the way it was sort of argued when it was put in place was that if we dock the student for not showing up, they do have the ability to do the study again. They can earn those points back, and it is not going to do anything but impact those enrichment credits that they're supposed to earn. And I go back and forth about it. It's one of those that I'm going to say you have to think it through and you make sure you're not doing anything that's going to unduly influence anyone. That's the basic idea. Excuse me. All right. So we also have to give students an alternative assignment. And so since we do have those enrichment credits for our Psych 101 students, they don't have to do research to get those credits. They can actually do an alternative activity if for whatever reason they don't want to do research to get those points. So they have that choice as well. And somebody asked, what are the biggest challenges to obtaining truly informed consent in research, especially when participants may feel pressured or may not fully understand the study, what is being asked, you've got to explain it to them. That's the whole purpose of assent. And things like I said just a minute ago, if you're doing it like for points, because that's always been the big debate, is can we give points for research? Should it just be bonus? That's been for as long as I've been in the profession, that's been a debate about how to do this. What the profession has always sort of come back to is that if you're going to do it for points, you have to give them an alternative opportunity. I would argue also, like when we give bonus points for going to the Understanding Us talk, it's important that the faculty give the students other ways for them to get bonus points so that they wouldn't be unfairly penalized by not going. So keep it balanced. And you need to make sure you explain it to them in language they understand. The other question I had about 802 was the possible consequences of declining participation or leaving the study. So the point was that was different from what they had been taught in the classes, because the classes teach you the exact perfect way to do things, and we're not doing high stakes research. So basically, like for example, with the enrichment credits, that penalty, the way the enrichment credits are set up is not supposed to be more than a certain percentage of the overall grade, which means that even if they got a 0 out of those enrichment credits, it's not going to be enough to basically dock them a letter grade or have an excessive penalty in terms of them not doing them. That's the other sort of what everyone always came back to when this has been debated. However, if you're doing a study like, for example, you're getting a free treatment, like I'm in a treatment trial, then the person has to know. That's what these sort of, does it have it? No. There we go. Let's see, here we go. So if you withdraw, and I thought there was one about this, so if, for example, someone is in a treatment trial, like a medication trial, and this slide is a little confusing because it said informed consent procedures must assure participants currently receiving services that dissent will not disrupt their ongoing treatment, inform individuals new to the treatment facility of available alternative services. Okay. It's like, wait, no, here's what that means. If I'm testing a new medication, right, or you sign up for a medication trial at Pennington, if you are withdrawn from the study for whatever reason, or you decide to withdraw from the study, you do not continue to get that medication. It's an experimental medication. There has to be certain guidelines in place. We can't keep giving it to someone, for example, who's not going to show up for the blood level checks to make sure that there's or the side effect checks, So if that happens, the medication trial, for example, that I was on, the idea was that if you were in the control group, then basically, if you were getting the placebo, that at the end of the treatment, you would be able to then get the active medication should the data suggest that this was working. Someone who withdraws from the study when they're part of that control group would not have that ability to go get the active medication once, because they withdrew from the study. So that's the kind of penalty that would occur in sort of a natural situation. We have to tell students up front about the being docked if you don't show up for an in-person study. That's only for an in-person study, because in-person studies are more labor intensive. We also don't do a lot of those these days. So students have to know that if they don't answer all the questions, they might not get the credit. And different faculty members have different rules about that. But, if somebody just clicks yes to the consent and they don't fill out the rest of it, then I don't give them the credit. They didn't do the study. And so basically, they have to know that if they can withdraw, but they're not going to get the points if they haven't finished completing the material. So it's that kind of penalty is what this is talking about. And also, if someone, for example, is in a treatment facility, you can't withhold treatment or withhold standard of care simply because they refuse to participate in a study. So this is where you're looking at things like those alternative treatments. Like, if you don't do my study, that doesn't impact your ability to continue to get treatment that you're already getting, is what this slide was about. So Make sure I got all of this one. And I can't think of a legitimate reason someone would ethically face consequences. It's usually, I mean, it's things more like if you don't do the enrichment credits and you don't do the alternative, you don't get the points. If you don't show up, you get docked, but you can make it up. Beyond that, I think we start sliding into really unethical things where, like, you're a prisoner, and if you don't do this, you're not going to get outside time. That's when it becomes unethical. So, all right, so I think I botched that one. Meaning I'm really tired. Yeah, it's probably a bad idea to have your students be your participants. So I do want to talk about this one because I think 805 was the next one. So basically, this is when we don't have to get informed consent. So if it's a normal educational practice. So for example, one of the normal educational practices that we have to do is our assessment. It's a big thing we have to do where we look at certain markers in certain classes in terms of, are we meeting them? Technically, that's part of a normal class procedure, and I wouldn't necessarily have to get informed consent to use that data for research. If I want to compare a one-on-one class where I'm using PowerPoints to chalkboard, don't necessarily have to get informed consent. I would still probably do it, but you don't have to. Yeah, so anonymous survey research, technically, that's why a lot of our SurveyMonkey stuff does not necessarily have to have a full informed consent, is because it's anonymous. So as long as it's anonymous, you don't technically have to do it. As a good sort of say, the cover letter is required by the university, and I still think it's a good idea to get people to click and say, yes, I'm going to do this. Naturalistic and archival research. This one actually falls into sort of two questions. And so let me read the questions and then we're going to go. Oh yeah, don't rely on Google's AI overview. It quotes some weird shit. It basically, dispense with informed consent means this is when we just don't have to get it. You can do your research without actually having the person sign off and say it's okay. But again, it's anonymous. It's when it's readily available information, so to speak. Like the educational practices one is one that was always a little confusing for me. But if you're already doing it in the classroom and you can get the information, I think anonymously again, I think of it as like instructional methods, not individual data that gets identified. But and yeah, and so the answer to the question, yes, you do not have to give informed consent if it's an anonymous survey that doesn't cause any sort of distress. So, sorry, it was a long question. Not picking on the person who wrote it, just wanted to make sure I had it all. So the second one that asked about this was that like chat rooms and forums that fit under the criteria are considered naturalistic. But if the research is looking into hate speech, racism, misogyny, etc., even though it's completely public, would doing this be allowed if you do not name the chat room or forum? Yeah. So basically, this is part of the slides. Basically, if you're on, like I'm on Reddit, I have no expectation of privacy if I'm posting stuff on Reddit, even though it's not my full name. Somebody can track that shit down. And there actually was a police officer who got fired because they were posting stuff on the Pit of Despair known as Tiger Droppings. Really racist, nasty stuff. And so, you have no think of it as if you have no expectation of privacy, then you can do a naturalistic study. But also that can lead to a whole bunch of ethical quandaries that you really need to think through. Hate speech, all that sort of stuff. But then what do you do if someone starts talking about suicide or harming other people? some of those forums will have some really nasty shit. And technically, free speech means they can. You're waiting in there, and you need to think that through and have a lot of conversations and read a lot of law. But technically, if it's anonymous, it's anonymous, and that also means you can't act on something that's out there. So chat rooms, blogs, listservs are natural, but it's only if it's naturalistic if they have no reasonable expectation of privacy, which I think I would probably go down a rabbit hole of, like, if I DM someone, is that an expectation? If you can DM them, yeah, that would mean they really didn't have any expectation of privacy if you can send a direct message, right? Are you a passive observer? Because you're not supposed to manipulate stuff. You need to make sure that the data is not traceable back to a person to protect their anonymity, and it's not going to hurt anybody. So be careful. Now, then you go into, so does it hurt somebody if you report them for being a Nazi? Yeah, but, again, that was a legal thing. That was a hiring and firing situation. If you're doing research, then technically you're probably not supposed to do that. So this is a lot of gray stuff, and I'm going to argue that, it's keep in mind it's naturalistic observation when the person has no expectation of privacy. You also have to follow the whole Star Trek, one directive: we don't manipulate the situations or interfere. So, for anybody who's a Star Trek or Star Trek geek. But again, you really need to think this stuff through. I don't do this type of research. As a general rule of thumb, there's other faculty who do. I know one of our current faculty had done some stuff looking at blogs about certain types of information that are out there. I think what they opted to do was provide a link to the survey, and not just rely on that naturalistic observation component. So just think it through. You have to plan very carefully and protect people's privacy, and again, not cause distress or harm. Oh gosh. Let's see. Oh yeah, but be careful, because there might be some unique communities where even if don't have their name, they could basically figure out who you're talking about. Yeah, publicly available documents, you have no right to privacy. So, yeah, here's the IO one. Again, it could be sort of considered naturalistic observation, but again, you got to make sure you protect the people that you're actually observing. You ask about this stuff. So with kids, it has to be minimal risk, and you better have an IRB sign off on that. So, yeah, I told you guys passive consent is very controversial, and I'm just going to leave that there and let you guys who are doing kids research talk to the folks who are supervising you. So nobody asked about deception. So you guys know, if we only deceive if we have to, and you definitely debrief after. Oh yeah, well, you don't have to. I would also say this one says that, like, where was it? Shoot, did the wrong one. You don't have to delete someone's data. I would argue that if someone asks you to delete their data and it is identified, like, they tell you there was a number or something, I think you should probably do that. If it's anonymous, though, you don't know how. I mean, you wouldn't know how. Yeah, don't commit fraud. Already talked about that. All right, so publication credit. There was a couple about these. So, wait, where was the termination? I guess, did I just not have a slide on that? So, as an animal lover, 809. Okay, where's that 809? Oh, huh. Well, I guess they decided not to have a slide about that. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and answer the question, though, because I just downloaded these straight from the SAGE website. So 809, basically, the standard states that psychologists act swiftly when an animal's life is to be terminated. What about when they are euthanized at the end of an experiment for research purposes? Yes. We have to treat animals humanely. And so what I was always taught, and again, my one trip through a rat lab, I was not gonna do that. I couldn't. I won't cook a lobster, you know. Always this close to being a vegetarian. So basically, you have to treat them humanely. And that would mean if you do have to euthanize, it should be done as quickly, as efficiently, and as painlessly as possible. So, and beyond that, there are, you would have to have permission if you're going to do something that involves pain, and there would have to be a good reason to study that if that was part of the research. But again, it should have, I think that if you are working with animals, I think you have to disclose how you're going to euthanize them. So I think, but again, I'm going to have to look that up. But again, always treat them with care, and it needs to be quick. So is it ethical to submit a paper to a different journal after one journal has rejected your, yes, it is actually. Sometimes the reasons for rejections are usually not, it doesn't mean it's a bad study. It can be things like a bad fit for the journal. And in the review process, they give you feedback to hopefully improve. Okay, worst review ever was someone who told me I obviously had never worked with someone with eating disorders before in my lifetime. I was probably not a native English speaker, and I should really reconsider my career path. The two other reviewers, though, really liked the article. And so you get 3 different opinions, and those other 2, and usually all 3, even the asshole is always reviewer 2. They always make the asshole reviewer 2. The idea is they're giving you feedback for how to make the study better. And so you can take that feedback and improve your study and resubmit. A lot of times it's a fit issue. This isn't the right journal. This isn't the best place for you to try this. And so you can make those changes. This is duplicate publication. This is like if I do a study on this 100 participants and I publish it, but then I go publish it in a large part in another journal. I think I told you guys, there's one researcher that I cite a lot, but it looks like what he did is he had one big ass study, and if you look very closely, he diced it up, which sometimes is too much for one study, but that's not exactly what you are supposed to do. That would be like multiple or piecemeal report of different aspects of a single project. You have to have a good theoretical reason for doing that. And I think it would also be important to make sure that people know that you have published part of this data before. So usually that would happen, like I tend to throw in a kitchen sink. There would just be no way to get this all into one publication, and it makes sense given space requirements. But I should probably try to submit it to the same journal, but definitely make sure both editors know that I have published part of this before, and this is why I'm choosing to submit it as 2 studies instead of 1. So, but you resubmitting is not that, and quite often it takes multiple submissions to a couple different journals to get something published. The study with the reviewer 2, I think it was the 4th journal that I went to, and one journal kept it for over a year in the review process, which was really shitty of them. But it was just it was a controversial study. People didn't like the results, but it was still a good study. And so basically not liking the results doesn't mean that they're not good results. So how do you reasonably decide which journal to submit a paper to. You probably get different pieces of advice, but the one I always go with is I look for where similar articles have been published most often. And that's usually my go-to. So if my reference list tends to have a lot of articles from a particular journal, that's the one I'm going to try first. So, and then there are other, pragmatic factors. The open access ones cost so much money these days. I'm being priced out of a couple of my go-tos. But all right, so sorry, this went longer than I thought it would. If you're working with someone on a publication and you both did equal amounts of work on the project, your colleagues asked to be listed as the sole first author, would it be ethical to allow this to happen? I think that you have to work that out ahead of time. So first of all, this is what a substantial intellectual contribution means. So just collecting data is not enough, basically. I tend to be fairly generous with publication credits. Some folks aren't. There was somebody at LSU who was a real asshole and claimed that you're not supposed to claim somebody's dissertation, but he was pretty quick to do it on thesis projects. It was my idea. I gave it to you. I'm first. That was a shitty thing for him to do, but there you go. So it would be difficult to have a situation where two people were truly the first author. I know that for some of the RIPS projects, some of the faculty members are pretty good at distributing that amongst. I think in other situations outside of RIPS, that would be a RIPS poster. That would be when the faculty supervisor would probably take first authorship. But I think that if there's a situation, I think before you go too far, y'all need to work it out. And first authorship should reflect someone that either it is more their original idea, or it is, if all the other work is equitable, but it was one person's idea, they should probably be first. After that, it should truly be based on who has put the most work into it, and don't discount what the faculty supervisors have to do to actually get the project going. I think that with that one, when people have gotten a little huffy with me on rare occasions, I try to be kind of generous. I've had a few folks who are like, well, would you have been able to do this without me? And so if the answer to that is yes, then make your case. So, but basically, having someone where it's truly, truly equal amounts of work, my dissertation, one of my co-authors was mad at me because I was taking too long to get it published and wanted to take it and be first author. No, that was my dissertation. It was my project. That was unethical for her to ask. If it is really a group effort, I think y'all need to sit down and figure it out ahead of time and not try to figure it out on the back end. Because, if I'm not first author, I'm still going to contribute. But if you're going to be first author, then you've got to earn that. So, if I did most of the work, hell no. I'm sorry, no. No. That's unethical if you put somebody else first, even though they didn't do most of the work. So the good news is like places like what we do is that the faculty recognize how much of a contribution it is for the faculty member on for example, a thesis that is published. And so what we do is that, we want to promote that the student gets first authorship. So what we do in terms of tenure and promotion is count that as if it were a first authorship for the faculty supervisor. So not everybody's going to approach it that way. So you need to have a conversation with your supervisor, with your co-authors, and you need to decide it up front. But it would be unethical to give someone first authorship if it was not truly what they had earned. So no matter what the reason. Does it happen? I don't know. People tend to be too cutthroat to give that away. So, but no, that would be unethical for them to ask. So, last one. Oh, since data repositories are becoming more popular, are you allowed to use data for your own research without getting the original researcher's permission? the ethics code hasn't caught up to this one. So basically, most of this is about sharing research for data for verification. So it's to retest the data. So I'm going to give you what I think would be best practices. You should contact the author. Whether it's ethical or not, since, there's not a clear ethical code, I think you would also need to go look at like the data repository rules, so to speak. It might have in their repository information about the use of the data. There are some big open data sets that people have access to. So I think you need to stick to those. People want to, there are, especially in social psych, there are some huge like personality, item databases for you to use that are free use. There's also, like data published on our university website. We could actually, have access. There's a common data set that anyone can tap into because it's data that's collected and shared, but it's identified as such. So if you're not sure, ethical or not, it'll be interesting to see what happens in that new ethical code that's coming out. I think you should still ask. It's just good practice. Measures that are free use. Technically, you don't have to get their permission, but I still do. It's just a good practice, and it's just a nicer thing to do. So, no. If the data is out there and shared, again, it usually would have some stipulation. Like there are a couple of researchers that if you use their measure, they want you to cite them. There are some people who want authorship if you get their data. So you need to ask and verify and make sure you're doing what they asked. The other thing is keep in mind that chances are if they've got a big ass repository of data out there, they are probably a much more big time researcher than you are, and you really don't want to piss them off. So be polite and make sure they will specify the rules. That's not really in the ethical code yet, so I can't really answer that from a here's what the ethics says. I'm going to say this is what you should do as a decent human being and good researcher. All right, so this one went way too long. I'm really sorry. I didn't think it was going to take this long, guys. If you hung in till the very end, thank you.